Do you remember that game? Yes, I mean that game. The game that sort of put you under a spell, hypnotized you in a way nothing you've played before ever had. To say you were in the Matrix was an understatement. This was your whole world. Yes, I too, despite my solemn title now as the Roblox RPG Schizo Incel Dev Reviewer, once had such regards for a game once. I wanted to forget about the old times, but you fucks voted on this on the one and only poll I will ever fucking do again on my YouTube channel. Fuck you all. On a serious note though, let me know if the poll was a good idea and if you would want more for future reviews. But such worlds are hard to come by, especially when you're a broke kid who can afford to play any actual games, and yet you find yourself craving a certain type of adventure that is rare on the one platform you actually play on, because all the games you can find on there are free. At least for the most part, they were. That is why Swordburst Online was such an innovation, not just to me, but for the larger part of the Roblox community. At a time when games relied on minigame types experiences and large-scale projects were few and far between, I don't think I'm in disagreement with most people when I say that SBO was one of the founding creations for new age Roblox MMORPGs, and its effects on how the genre is made on the platform continues to be felt even today. It was, in whole, a truly influential piece of Roblox RPG history. So how did we end up here, at the third installment in the series, with the release of a free beta with an active player count of fucking 43 people? I know this is kind of subject to change now, and the last time I checked it was around 5,000, but this is still pretty low given the reputation of Swordburst. And yeah, I may be a little cynical at times, but when the collective agreement between RPG players today is that Swordburst 3 is a steaming piece of shit that isn't worth even nothing at all to play, let alone 100 Robux for the let alone 100 Robux for the beta, then holy fuck, you've got a big fucking problem on your hand, let alone the fact that you've single-handedly made a gruesome massacre out of one of the most well-known franchises on the platform today. In the poll, I kind of made it seem like I was just originally going to do a shitty unscripted rain on the game, and that was the original intention, but only out of respect to its progenitor have I decided to turn this into a full dive into not only Swordburst 3, but also a full delve into its predecessors. What were their successes, their failures, and ultimately determine the question burning on everyone's mind right now. Where did it all go so wrong? My name is Spirited Default, and if you will, please join me on the full-length reviews of Swordburst Online, Swordburst 2, and the ultimate fall of Swordburst 3. The origins of Swordburst were a humble one. Abstract Alex, at this point in time going by the name of Rukirio, decided to completely scrap his game Sword Art Online Burst, an RPG operated on a floor-by-floor basis that was a project heavily inspired by the anime Sword Art Online, a story involving gamers playing the release of a VR RPG finding that they cannot leave the game, and dying in the game means you die in real life. Sprinkled out with a little bit of wacky Playboy protagonist shenanigans, fan service, and incest stuff, and you have yourself another run-of-the-mill anime. If you can't tell, I'm not much in the way of being a fan of this series. But we're talking about the games here. After extensive work on this project, Rukirio showed off more and more tidbits, and even showcased using some of the latest Roblox features of the time within the game, including the alleged claim that SAOB would be the first Roblox universe to use a new VIP servers feature. Slowly, the game evolved into something beyond the scope of his original vision, but he still felt that something was lacking. In his eyes, the title no longer fit the scope of the project, and choosing to herald the game as an original concept, he made the declaration that the game would be undergoing a full rebrand on the 13th of September 2015. The following day posting the iconic thumbnail and the new name of what would be Swordburst Online, which would officially release that same week on the 19th. I'm just getting this off of Twitter, so don't kill me. I don't think I need to say much on the game's popularity given the waves it's made on the platform back then and even today. If Roblox gave your game a review back in the day, you knew you were the shit. Swordburst was the first of its kind and truly felt like the platform's first RPG of such grand magnitude. Up until that point, there were very few projects that scaled more than 1,000 studs or so, given that mini-games and smaller worlds were more popular during the time. Not only did this project feature larger maps, but also featured a game that spanned different places. This was possible for a while up until that point, but not until then had anyone really made big success with integrating the features so closely with the player's experience. Going back today, you can see the foundation of what would come to make Swordburst Swordburst. The lack of an extraneous magic system, a sword-oriented clicker combat, maps that felt large but not a big hassle to traverse, and smaller features that would only boost the fundamental experience and make the player feel like they were progressing in more ways than just combat. I'm not going to dick ride and say that like this game was peak. I hopped back on actually and tried to pick up where I left the game to progress somewhat because I don't think I ever finished it, just trying to improve my crafting and smithing stats or whatever. And alongside some other problems, a few glaring issues would appear that unfortunately still seem to plague the franchise to date. So now we can get into a little bit of reviewing. For one, the progression is too slow and too linear. Swordburst gets off easy for this, given it was a first attempt, a prototype if you will, at a framework that was larger than anything else seen before on Roblox up to that point. with a definite progression system that wasn't just arbitrary numbers being thrown around or something. But regardless, this was an issue. For many, the game began to drag past floor 4 and 5 as the game quickly set up a play loop that set itself up to be a grindfest that some people like myself didn't have the patience for. Secondly, there is little the game offers besides reskins of the same cookie clicker combat. I actually give props to SBO for at least making an effort to incorporate sub-mechanics like crafting and cooking, as well as a player-centered merchant system, which was cool, but without constraints quickly led to scams, and I'd even argue pioneered the practice of boosting in Roblox MMORPGs. I will say that the incorporation of abilities in Swordburst 2 and 3 do appear to kind of change up the combat to some degree, but at the same time, it really does still feel like you can fundamentally go through the game without ever needing to use these abilities, unless you just want to, like, kill enemies faster, but then again, it's like, come on. Finally, there is the question of the floor issue. I praised earlier, and even now I'd argue that in many cases this was essential and actually helped players see the grand scope of the game that they were playing. But especially for the smaller floors, you got the sense that on each instance, it didn't really need to be condensed to its own place, and you were really just going through the motions of walking through an identical environment that simply had different colors and textures, but offered nothing fundamentally unique or game-changing on each floor you were introduced to. There was no direction to the game, an issue that was even pointed out on the official Roblox review of the game. It's just to get to the menacing tower when you're strong enough and then move to the next tower. Not much else really. This all being said though, people still played Swordburst. It was enjoyable, and it was new. Anyways, you couldn't really be picky, especially when it came to RPGs back then. Like, what else did you have, like, shit on? I can't even think of any. Community was the key to making the experience so memorable, and I'm sure you can find many a video out there with trade deals taking place behind the shops on the first floor village, or a squad of friends documenting their navigation through the dark labyrinth on the second floor looking to raid the boss dungeon. Me personally, I share vivid memories of one beachside summer when I was staying at a resort with my family, and instead of making the most of the beach and the sun and pina coladas and stuff, I, like a true Roblox incel, prefer to stay inside on most days and use the hotel's computer lab to run Roblox and play early Swordburst. Yeah, those were good times. Am I estranged from my family now? Perhaps, but at least I got to play a good Roblox RPG. For the time. But people forgave the game's flaws because it felt like the start to something amazing. Of course there would be bumps on the road to get to the ultimate destination, and with talks of a potential sequel in the near future, and Rukirio's dive into further RPG projects on the platform under his new name Abstract Alex, things seemed bright for the future of Swordburst, as well as the future of all Roblox RPGs out there. And the greater community thought that we were only getting a taste of what was to come with the debut of Shard Online. In October of 2015, the same year in which he officially debuted Swordburst as we know it today, Abstract Alex teased a new RPG that he was working on that included features such as class unlocks and similar mechanics to things we had already seen in SBO. I may be wrong on this one since it looks rather different, but I'm going to take this to be one of the earliest screenshots of his next work following SBO, that being Shard Online. The project started up on Roblox in March of 2016 and was likely released sometime later. Before Swordburst 2 was officially announced, there were rumors going around that this game would be the sequel to SBO, so it got a fair amount of hype surrounding it, and people were really impressed at the time with what was being showcased in teasers leaked by the Shard team or Alex himself. People were already deeming Swordburst to be old news, and people locked onto this as the objective successor, the improvements in all aspects to be. It blew up for a bit and died. Then people went back to Swordburst. I personally played the game and I only got to like level 7 before leaving and never returning until I hopped back on to record some content for this video, but the question on everyone's mind was what would happen? Why? I don't think anyone disagrees when I say this game succeeded in topping Swordburst's visuals and overall design. Hell, a lot of it I'd even argue still holds up by 2024 Roblox standards. A lot of the combat feels more refined, enemies feel a little smarter, they had quests I believe, and they really took the open world concept and ran with it completely. So why did it fail? If you ask me personally, there are a lot of factors that go into it, but I'd say that one of the biggest issues was that it lacked the direction that SBO had. Okay, Spirit. You made fun of Rogue Lineage, and for that I called you Yapper Autis Filtered Tard. You consistently criticize most Roblox RPGs, and yet you are working on one that you believe will be able to successfully evade these same criticisms. But now you're telling me a game that was this fleshed out and even included a feature you've almost always demanded in previous reviews lacked direction? Please go take your meds, or just kill yourself. Damn, okay. First off, pause and read this wall of text if you find yourself genuinely hating me. And second, yes, I do believe that it lacked some level of direction. Having basic collect or kill quests in the midst of a well-detailed world doesn't suddenly mean you've created the best RPG on the Roblox platform, because in reality, this is really just doing the bare minimum to make a tolerable experience. Swordburst at the time for new players did take a little bit of a learning curve at first to understand the principle of the game, but it's intrinsically designed in such a way that it's practically second nature once you get the concept. That large tower in the distance is your objective, and your goal is to kill whatever's inside, preventing you from finding the next tower on the next world. It doesn't need to explicitly tell you because the world's designed in that convenient manner. It fits what the game's trying to do. But with Shard, many people, including myself, felt so fucking lost. I talked about this issue in my Visteria review, but for some reason, Roblox terrain is really hard to navigate, and you can find yourself either running in circles or being completely lost. And I believe this was the issue for me back then, as well as many others, especially given that at the time terrain was also relatively new and was still controversial when it was incorporated into games. I'd also argue that taking the same directionless format as Swordburst, yet making it an entirely original concept, was sort of a disadvantage, given that, at least with Swordburst, people could look at Sword Art Online and be like, oh yeah, so this is kind of like that, so I assume it takes the same sort of progression. When with Shard, it was a completely new thing, people didn't know what to expect, and then you were thrown in a world with no direction or purpose or large menacing tower to follow, so people were just kind of lost and didn't know what to do. And if I'm being honest today, I still don't really know what the progression of Shard is, and I'm too lazy to do an internet search, but ultimately, what you can take away from this is that one of the biggest issues with Shard was that an objective was not intrinsic to the experience, and as such, people did not know what direction to take, whether this meant literally or metaphorically in their gameplay, leading to the eventual impatience and abandoning of the experience. Lots of big words there, but basically just no one had a fucking clue what to do. And unless you wanted to kind of look it up, you were kind of on your own. Also, there was some flack and controversy because apparently they put dual wielding, which was a feature that was free in SBO behind a paywall, and yeah, if you're putting free features from past games as paid features and new ones just to turn a profit, unless you're like radically changing the system, then I think that's just a scummy thing to do. So people probably weren't also happy with that either. But yeah, a lot of this, amongst other issues, ultimately culminated in a lot of the community just sort of retreating from Shard and going back to Swordburst Online, opting to stick to their guns because they felt that Swordburst was just a more welcoming experience, and Shard already kind of looked to be a little bit shaky in terms of community reception. So people opted for the less visually refined yet still satisfactory SBO to keep their RPG needs at bay. Ultimately, their needs were met when the official announcement for the sequel of the franchise came out on November 30th, 2016. While many people were hyped for the upcoming release, there was also a lot more shady glances being cast on the project due to the series of events following Shard's release, and Abstract Alex's quiet handoff of the project to other developers, and slowly leading all updates to a complete halt. I said before that Shard wasn't exactly a hit, and that's true, but nevertheless it amassed a cult following with people who were alarmed at the notice of a new project so soon. This was less than a year after Shard had officially debuted. There was a lot of effort that was visually and mechanically put into this game, and there was a lot of potential to be had, which is why even today you can see that they're trying to make a second release of the same Shard franchise. But largely, this is why people were so disturbed when Swordburst 2 was released so suddenly, out of nowhere, when they were in the middle of this project, it seemed. A lot of people, particularly on Twitter, also weren't happy about the fact that the developers were radio silent on the transferability of game passes from the original game to the future sequel. Which is understandable given that some of these game passes from both games did the exact same thing, such as with the 2x XP rate and whatnot. But despite all these little inklings of doubt, the majority of the community were eager for the new release and anticipated the game with high hopes and a faith that old memories would be reborn once again. And then, on February 18th, 2017, Swordburst 2 opened with paid early access, with the full release coming later that same year on November 3rd. And it did fairly well. The game was not only ported on mobile as was the first installment, but also featured the inclusion of the Xbox port of the game and had its share of the front page in its earlier days. Yet people shared their dissatisfaction, and as for me, well, you already know my feelings on the game's impact. I know I'm already like 14 minutes in and I've spent so much time on the first two games without even talking about the original game I was going to make a review on in the poll, but the reason for this is that I really want to stress why Swordburst 2 was the beginning of the end for the franchise, why it was so poisonous to the future of Roblox RPGs, and generally why it wasn't a good game as is. And a lot of these features did end up contributing, at least in my opinion, to why Swordburst 3 turned out so shit in the eyes of so many people. Post-production spirit here, this is not to say that I believe that Swordburst 2 fell off, it wasn't as good as the original, it wasn't as popular, because it definitely was, and I can respect that, and I don't think it was like a bad game, standalone by any means. I'm just saying that this is the reason why when people were playing the first Swordburst, and then they went on to play Swordburst 2, they were kind of let down in terms of that aspect because they were expecting something more that you would expect from, you know, like your average sequel. But anyways, carrying on. There are so many complaints I've heard from this community over the years, as well as some personal ones I have, but I'll try to cover most of the key points that we'll see later on that still echo today in Swordburst 3, at least from what I've seen so far. The first thing right off the bat is that people felt like they were really just playing Swordburst 1 again. Yeah, I know it's a second Swordburst game, but even with games like Dark Souls 1 through 3 and other game series, you get the fundamental elements of things that you're familiar with, yet the game introduces enough new and unfamiliar aspects that make it feel like an entirely new experience. For many, including myself, I felt that the gameplay loop was virtually the same, except with just a fresh new coat of paint that just made things look fancy. Some floors were new, visually speaking, but people were expecting something of a little bit more innovation. At least this was the general feel of the time. Furthermore, some people had more criticism as Shard Online appeared as though it had more work put into it through both its animated enemies as well as features that had been largely in demand in SBO for a while, like quests. Both features did not make it into SBO 2, and justifiably so. You had people recognizing the fact that Alex and the team had prior capacity to add these things into their game, yet deliberately chose not to, not even in a later update installment that included the new floors and minor bug fixes. I should also say that it's worth mentioning that a lot of players believed that less quality was put in overall in terms of the actual world design and the immersion, because while Swordburst 1 did a good job in preventing players from sort of, breaking the map, or at least trying to give a more authentic illusion of the world, in Swordburst 2 they almost blatantly had these features such as lakes making you fall out of the world, and maps that didn't do so good in covering up ways to escape the world and just fall out of the world again. This also pissed off the aforementioned Shard following, as their game, which up until that point had felt more polished and fleshed out than Swordburst 2, felt virtually abandoned. Another issue people took with the game is what little it did to address problems that players recognized within the first installment of the series, namely progression and gameplay diversity. It actually felt more difficult to honestly progress than it did in Swordburst 1. I say quote-unquote honestly because they added attack dummies to the first floor that players ended up using to grind levels easily, leading to the breaking of the entire progression system and leading to a lot of AFK farming. Holy fuck, if you remember Shinobi Life 2, this is kind of like I was getting PTSD to that. Despite the inclusion of abilities, new visuals, amongst minor world improvements, people still felt like the game was stuck in the same identical progression loop of the first game, really doing nothing to encourage players to do anything else besides prepare for the boss tower. Some stuff was even added that only encouraged players to rush through the game, such as a running feature that hinged on a stamina system I'm not very enthused with. Again, I talked briefly on why such kind of systems suck when you incorporate them with movement in my Hysteria video. Many, including myself, actually believe they took a step back from the things SBO did well with, given the removal of craftable weapons and armor as well as food. I understand food was pretty seldom used, I didn't really use it much, and honestly the same can be said of crafting and smithing, but people still appreciated this concept and it felt like another way to improve your character beyond just whacking shit with your sword. But instead we ended up getting the upgrade crystals, a feature that feels inherently pointless, less creative, and a direct downgrade really from the original crafting system. But I'll explain why either later on or in part 2. I could talk about a multitude of issues that came newly with Swordburst 2 and even carried on from Swordburst 1, such as the boss drop systems encouraging high-level players to grind lower floor bosses and preventing new players in that floor from getting earnest kills or even credit at all, an issue that persisted from the first game, or the horrendous level system that felt designed to obligate players to purchase the 2x EXP Game Pass, improper scaling between the later floors, namely the jump from floor 8 to 9, or hell, even the trading, to which many felt a lot more personal and vulnerable than the previous instantiation system, with allegations of player killing upon declining unsolicited trader requests, making the game more toxic than it was in its last installment. But I'll gloss over it. In my opinion, I think the problem people had with SBO 2 is that when you advertise the game as a sequel to a project, a quote-unquote sequel, they expect some grand level of change besides just the map in order to truly make it feel like it built upon the last installment. So in my eyes, this game would have probably gotten a lot more praise and acceptance today if it were better called Swordburst Remastered, because it's virtually the same game and besides the implementation of abilities, it remained that way in the eyes of players. Personally, I remember playing through a chunk of the game without using any abilities besides running, because they were somewhat negligible since it was never necessary to move forward in the game. I don't believe I've mentioned it too often in my past reviews, but I have mentioned a practice known as the Swordburst strat, where you play an RPG with enemies that are so neutered and mentally deficient that you can circle around them using shift lock and spam click in order to kill them while taking minimal damage. And that's an issue that's continued in SBO 2 and is only worse in the third installment. And you know what, it's sad, it really sucks when you look at PvP videos of SBO 3 because the strategies with dashing back and forth and all the abilities used, those strategies and those clips show the possibility the game has for PvE if the enemies were at least even slightly more challenging, yet we continue to have brain dead enemies that cater to these mobile players that get stuck behind walls and other stupid shit like that. And with the rise of the RPG genre itself in the late 2010s on Roblox, making more competitors for Swordburst 2, and many people seeing that Swordburst 2 was not doing enough, or at least not at a fast rate, to keep up with the competition, a lot of people started to jump ship. All of this in tandem with the repeated and lazy reuse of assets in the later half of the game's updates, in addition to the slow desertion over time of each and every one of the developers, including Abstract Alex himself, Swordburst 2 was left in the hands of player contributors and only a small fraction of the original dev team to carry on with the project, while everyone else looked to broader horizons for what was to come in the RPG world. Little did people know, though, that it was only going to get bleaker from here. So yeah, that was part 1 of this 2-part series on the Swordburst trilogy. I wasn't actually going to make such a big fat video for this, but I figured that since Swordburst is kind of a part, the third installment is not just its own thing, it's part of a larger thing. I decided that I might as well just knock all of them out of the park and review pretty much everything all at once. It turned out to be a pretty decently sized video, at least watching how long this is in a voice recording or whatever. So I hope this can kind of satiate you guys for a while. I'll try to work immediately on both videos at the same time, so they can kind of get out somewhat back to back, although you guys should know that yeah, I'm pretty notorious with the unreliability, but hopefully this is kind of not going to be the case with this. But I really enjoyed working on this, so yeah, stay tuned for part 2, and leave a comment or whatever, share, and yeah, thank you guys for watching. I have been Spirited Default, and have a nice day.